The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a proposed free trade agreement that will literally sign the globe over to corporate control. And as it stands, we, the people who will be most affected by this contract, won't be able to see how our sovereignty and our planet is being raped and ransacked in the name of potential profit margin until it is too late. TPP negotiations have taken place under a freakish cloak of secrecy, denying all but a very few any input into the terms of the agreement. The only people who have had access to the negotiations are 600 advisors, none of whom work for Congress, and 500 of which are corporate lobbyists. Even though the press, the public, and most members of Congress haven't seen details of the negotiations, the Obama administration hopes to fast-track the TPP by the end of this year. And the Obama administration has categorized the deal as classified information. Congressman Alan Grayson was permitted to review the document after filing a Freedom of Information Act. However, he was not allowed to comment on it. Here is what he did have to say about the TPP.
The result will be soon evident to everybody. When the agreement does get released, you'll see massive giveaways of our sovereignty, massive efforts to undermine the middle class in this country, massive efforts to keep us from making the decisions that we need to do to make ourselves safe, to keep ourselves healthy, and to actually have the kind of life we want to have. Why? Because we've given the entire process over to special interests. It's no longer even properly called a trade agreement. It's an anti-sovereignty agreement. It has very little, if anything, to do with trade at this point. And the fact that something like this can be negotiated in secret for over 3 years, it is an indication of how far our standards have fallen. I can't remember any time earlier in our history when we would have done this. I can't remember any time earlier in our history when we'd even make an effort to say that we couldn't have amendments on the floor of the House or the Senate about something that's so crucial to the way that we conduct our lives in the future.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership isn't anything to worry about is either lying or hasn't read their history. That's because so-called free trade deals like the TPP have been a disaster to most Americans in virtually every possible way. Take, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. When NAFTA first came on the scenes in the early 90s, its supporters said it would revolutionize the economy, create 170,000 jobs in just the first 2 years. But 20 years later, 2 decades later, it's left us with nothing more than a net loss of over 1 million American jobs, a trade deficit of $177 billion with NAFTA countries, and this is the real killer, a 12.2% decline in middle-class wages. NAFTA's evil cousin, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA, has also failed to live up to expectations. Although the Bush administration said it would lead to booming trade with Central America, CAFTA has instead destabilized that region and arguably caused the refugee crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. A 2012 U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, or KORUS, is another example of failed trade policy run amok. The Obama administration said it would boost exports by $11 billion and create 70,000 jobs. But just 1 year after passage, 40,000 jobs have been lost, while exports from the U.S. to South Korea actually fell by about $3.5 billion. Meanwhile, our trade deficit with South Korea has ballooned by 39.8%. Free trade has and always will be a sham, and its checkered history should make us very skeptical of the TPP, which has the potential to be the largest free trade deal in human history. Of course, because the TPP is being negotiated almost entirely in secret, we don't really know a lot about it. But what we do know comes almost entirely from leaks, and those leaks paint a pretty scary picture. Thanks to groups like WikiLeaks, we now know that the TPP would give big pharmaceutical companies virtual monopoly patent power, let corporations sue sovereign nations in international courts over regulations that those corporations don't like, and let corporations gut environmental and financial rules. In other words, the TPP isn't as much a trade deal as it is a goodie bag full of everything corporations have ever wanted but have been too afraid to ask for in public.
Mr. President, I rise in strong opposition to the fast-track bill that the Finance Committee approved last night that will be on the floor, I think, here next week or the following week on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The most important aspect, I think, of this debate is that what we are discussing with the TPP is not a new concept. It's not like somebody came up and said, I got a great idea. Let's try this trade agreement, and it's going to be really good for the American worker and the American middle class and the American people. The truth of the matter is that we have seen this movie time and time and time again. And let me tell you that the ending of this movie is not very good. It's a pretty bad ending. And I think most Americans understand that our past trade agreements have failed American workers and have led to the loss of millions of decent paying jobs. And what I simply don't understand, if we were going forward in the first place, new idea, maybe give it a shot. But when we went forward with NAFTA, went forward with CAFTA, went forward with permanent normal trade relations, and we heard all of these folks telling us how great these agreements were going to be, and it turned out that virtually everything that they said was inaccurate, not true. Why in God's name would we go forward with another trade agreement, which is in fact larger than previous trade agreements?
The move towards a sovereign state in the EU is picking up speed. We keep seeing this brought up time and again. And of course, we have said from the very beginning that when they create these trade blocs like NAFTA, like the European Union, the whole purpose of it is to create a sovereign entity, and then to join those regional sovereign entities into a larger collective until they get to a one world government. That has always been the objective. We see now that David Petraeus mentioned just last year, he said, well, you know, what comes after North America? What comes after America? North America. And then he went on to say that he was talking about the North American Union. He says, we're 20 years into the North American Union, so we need to take a look at this. It was 10 years ago that the Council on Foreign Relations, with Ted Cruz's wife as one of the members of this committee, was talking about what they should do with the North American Union, and their solution, their key recommendation from the Council on Foreign Relations 10 years ago, was to make sure that there was one common border around the three countries, that they would have a common law enforcement that would presumably be run by the Homeland Security and the guys in Washington. This is something that has always been in the cards for everyone. Destroying the sovereignty of Mexico, of America, and of Canada, subsuming them into a North American Union, doing the same in Europe. And let's look at what's going on with this. It was back in February, and we've reported this as well when it happened. Alan Greenspan, former chair of the Federal Reserve, said that he predicted that Greece would exit from the euro. He thought that it was inevitable that that would happen. They say, he goes on to say, though, he said, the problem is that there is no way I can conceive of the euro continuing unless and until all the members of the Eurozone become politically integrated. Actually, even just fiscally integrated won't do it. So in other words, they tell us, just as they told us about the North American Union, they said, this is about trade. It's simply about trade. There's nothing but trade. We said it was to destroy the sovereignty of the three countries involved.
We have reached a historic crossroads. The globalists are collapsing our republic right now in front of our very eyes. They are destroying national sovereignty to bring us into the North American Union. Crony capitalists that have created the planetary corporate system that we know as the New World Order have been very open about the fact that they want a homogenized, dumbed-down, poor global population that can be exploited for their labor and who will be very pliable in the social engineers' hands. And we have seen illegal aliens in the last 25 years or so pumped into this country, most of them legalized. Now they want to legalize between 20 and 30 million that are left, and Obama in the last few years has stopped deportations, has given awards to illegal aliens' children that are here illegally to create a giant flood, to accelerate the deluge that was already there. And that has now happened. We sent our reporters, Jakari Jackson and others, down to the Texas border last week, and what they discovered was even worse than what libertarian and constitutional media was reporting. Dinosaur media is saying, oh, America's evil, we should have totally open borders and give everyone free welfare, and you're hateful and racist if you don't take the immigrants in, and Obama not having deportations has nothing to do with the increased surge in illegals from Latin America and other parts of the world pouring across. Conservative media said, gee, it's terrible. Obama is encouraging it. What are we going to do? We better pass amnesty to stop it, which will only encourage it. Real media, media that's been absolutely on target, like Infowars.com, DrudgeReport.com, and WorldNetDaily.com, have been reporting on the fact that it's a premeditated plan to implode the borders, swamp the western states so bad that the feds come in an emergency and basically use this as a false flag crisis to bring in even more levels of control and force the passage of the Immigration Reform Act that supposedly gives them a legal way into the country when they're already being legalized by fiat. It'd be like if your boat had a leak in it, shooting more holes in the bottom of the boat and calling that a solution to the leak you have. It's absolutely insane how they promote this level of nation-ending garbage. And this is the end of the country. Mexico, Guatemala, and other Central and South American nations south of southern North America, where Mexico resides, are in a free-fall position. Crime rates have exploded across the Caribbean, not just Latin America, under the global depression. And America is like a lifeboat. As bad as we are economically, if we take on more unskilled workers and women with 3 or 4 children and no husband who go directly on welfare, this country will go bankrupt by design. But that is the Democratic Party's own plan from the 1960s. Cloward and Piven, the sociologist, a plan to use the welfare system to bankrupt the country and then bring in total socialism as
in 2005,
solution.
An arrangement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States was made. This arrangement, unannounced to the public, unregulated by Congress, merges the United States, Mexico, and Canada into one entity, erasing all borders. It's called the North American Union, and you might want to ask yourself why you've never heard of this. In fact, there is only one mainstream reporter who has actually heard of and has had the courage to cover this issue.
The Bush administration's open borders policy and its decision to ignore the enforcement of this country's immigration laws is part of a broader agenda. President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it, and he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States.
It's a deal that few have even heard of.
It's being done again by very few people at the very top on behalf of the investment class, but the working class of people, political officials across our country, from communities, from cities and so forth, they don't know anything about this.
This isn't some trade agreement. It is a total removal of sovereignty from these countries, which will also result in a completely new currency called the Amero.
Fall. Apart from that, I think one thing people who are dollar-based need to focus on is the Amero. That's the one thing that nobody's talking about, but I think it's going to have a big impact on everybody's life in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. The Amero is the proposed new currency for the North American community, which is being developed right now between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico to make a borderless community, much like the EU, and the dollar, Canadian dollar, U.S. dollar, and the Mexican peso replaced by the Amero.
By default of this agreement, the American Constitution will eventually be obsolete. You would think that a situation like this would be on the cover of every major newspaper. That is until you realize that the people who are behind this movement are the same people behind the mainstream media, and you are not told what you're not supposed to know. The North American Union is the same concept as the European Union, the African Union, and the soon-to-be Asian Union, and the same people are behind all of them. And, when the time is right, the North American Union, the European Union, the African Union, and the Asian Union will be merged together, forming the final stages of a plan these men have been working on for over 60 years. A one-world government. One bank, one army, one center of power. And if we have learned anything from history, it is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.